Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Evaluating Ecosystem Services webinar. My name is Alyssa Rowland, and I am the Communications Director for the California Rangeland Trust. And today's presentation, we will be exploring the findings from a recent study conducted by scientists at UC Berkeley, which looked at the value of ecosystem services and the return on investment of conservation easements held by the California Rangeland Trust. And before we get going, I just want to go through some logistics to help make this a good experience for everyone. We've gone ahead and muted all participants, so no need to do that. If you would like to ask a question, we welcome you to do so by going to your control panel on your screen. There you'll see a questions and answers section. Click that square to pop that out and go ahead and type your comments and questions in there, and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. And I also want to add that we are recording this webinar, and we will send the link out to those registered following the program. Leading this webinar today, we have Michael Delbar, the California Rangeland Trust CEO, and Dr. Lynn Huntsinger, Professor of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at UC Berkeley. So at this time, I will turn it over to Michael, who will review the agenda and kick things off.
Thank you, Alyssa. Appreciate all your work on this. So today's program is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk a little bit about who the California Rangeland Trust is. Then we'll get into the evaluation of ecosystem services and the key findings from that report. And then we'll end up with a question and answer period. So with that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who California Rangeland Trust is. So we were started by forward-thinking members of the California Cattlemen's Association 22 years ago. At the time, there were some funds available to do conservation easements on working lands in the state, but there weren't really any organizations that understood the ranching business. And so a conservation easement is a perpetual agreement. And having an organization that understands the ranching business is critical for the comfort level of that rancher to know that that partnership, that perpetual partnership, is with someone who understands his or her business. So the mission of the Rangeland Trust is to serve the land, people, and wildlife by conserving California's working landscapes. So in that short 22 years of existence, California Rangeland Trust has permanently protected over 342,000 acres across the state of California. Agricultural land in California is at a severe threat of conversion, and we see that in a new report from our friends at the American Farmland Trust, Farms Under Threat. California alone has lost 465,000 acres of farmland from 2001 to 2016. Of that 465,000 acres, 245,000 of that was rangeland. If you look at the amount of money that California invests in permanently protecting our working lands, it is 11 cents per capita. Put that in perspective, in context, Delaware, the state of Delaware invests $6.03 per capita. But the positive side is that California's working landscapes provide $333 billion in sales, 1.5 million jobs, and $85 billion in earnings in 2018. Now, if these current trends continue, we are at the risk of losing 2 million acres of farm and ranch land and all the benefits they provide by the year 2050. So that led us to wonder just what is the value besides the economic value of protecting these lands, but what about all the ecosystem services that these lands provide? Intuitively, we knew that there was a high value here, but we did not have any way of monetizing that. So we approached two funders with the idea of monetizing those ecosystem services, and they generously funded the study. So we'd like to thank the Resources Legacy Fund and an anonymous donor for that tremendous support, which led us then to figure out how can we do this, and who better to do it than the folks at UC Berkeley. So we approached Dr. Huntsinger and her team and asked them to do a study that would identify the economic values of these ecosystem services that these working lands provide to the state, and identify that return on investment of the conservation easements that we have in our portfolio. This is going to give us, what our expectation was, that it would give us a better understanding of the vital role of land conservation for California's future. So ecosystem services is an interesting term. And so what does that mean? It means things from provisioning services like providing for food and water, raw materials, medicinal resources, ornamental resources, regulating services such as climate regulation, waste treatment, erosion prevention, pollination, and biological controls. And then there's the habitat services such as life cycle maintenance and biodiversity maintenance, and cultural services such as aesthetics and recreation. So we asked UC Berkeley to do this study, and they did, and the results have been astounding. So to get into the meat of this study, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lynn Huntsinger from UC Berkeley, and she will go over the study.
Thank you so much, Michael and Alyssa. I really appreciate being here today, and I'm so glad that people are interested in the study. It was an eye-opener to me too, I have to say. I need to acknowledge my co-authors. Reed Johnson is a graduate student in agricultural and resource economics at Berkeley, and Van Butzik is an extension specialist and professor at Berkeley in my department. I myself am a range manager, so I learned a lot as a result of doing this study as well. I've worked with economists before, but this is my first time in California, and it's very exciting. So we decided to set about evaluating the ecosystem services from the California Rangeland Trust easements, and the trust supported us a great deal. I'm not talking about just the necessary funding, but also helping us look at the data they had from the vegetation types on the easements. Their geographical information system was essential, and with the cooperation and help of the staff at the trust, we were able to do this study. What is the challenge? Why is valuing ecosystem services so challenging? And there's a lot of reasons. Ecosystem services, the term and the concept, is about the services that nature provides people. It's not just anything that comes from nature, it's the things that people benefit from. And so what we're trying to do here is measure or monetize the value of those benefits. And if you think about it, all those things that Mike talked about as being ecosystem services, you realize some of them are pretty hard to put a value on. Food has a market price. You know, many things have a market price, but the cultural value of rangelands, the amount of oxygen produced, the recycling that rangelands do, the water that's provided, many of those things don't necessarily have a market price. The value of going on a hike to you, the value to me, when I was working in Sacramento for a couple years, of seeing the wonderful foothills that I pass through every day on my way home to here in the Bay Area. That was valuable to me. How do you put a dollar value on that? It's pretty hard. So that becomes the challenge, is putting a dollar value on it. And one of the reasons, why would we even want to put a dollar value on this? Well, it's to help with decision making about where we should put the money that we have for conservation, both as a group, as the Rangeland Trust, and as a state and a nation. So that the economic value helps us make these decisions, because we want to put our investment in the place where we're going to get the most value back in terms of ecosystem services. But I do have to say that right off the bat, we don't have all the information we need, of course. And of course, some things you just can't put a value on. Years ago, I worked with an economist, and we sent out a survey to people and asked them, what would be the price of your ranch if you had to sell it today? And they said, I would never sell my ranch. There's no price on it. So that's part of the challenge of a non-market ecosystem service valuation. So what we did, we applied a couple different methods using a couple different numbers of easements as a way to put bounds on what the values are, since we know we're not going to get the full value of everything. And we know that valuations that exist out there are not perfect for California. We used a number of different methods to be able to put a bounds on it all. So I'm going to try to go through that, and I hope it's not confusing, but the end results are not confusing. All right, so CRT has 56 conservation easements. They also have a number of mitigation easements. We didn't look at mitigation easements. They're often quite small and focus on a very narrow set of goals for a species or something else. They're very different, I think, in their goals and the way they're done than conservation easements. So we used the 56 conservation easements. Now, some of them are donated and some of them were purchased. So one of the things to remember is that economists don't understand zero as a divisor. So we have done the analysis with a cost, a known cost, so we can measure, we put this much in and we got this much back, and with the donated easements included where there was no or not much cost. And we have those two kinds of results too. So you'll also see that. So we use two different basic approaches on these easements. One of them is, well, they're all benefits transfer. Both methods are benefits transfer. Benefits transfer is a way of saying that we got information about one place, it was published, it was peer reviewed, it's been verified. This place is very similar to what's on an easement, so we transferred that value. So if one study said an oak woodland produces X dollars or X so much per acre in benefits each year, if it's an oak woodland, then we took that value and applied it to the California Rangeland Trust easements. You know, not enough of that ground level work has been done. It's really hard. It's really expensive. We need more of it. But we're in no different a position than anybody else who values conservation easements in the United States. Using the regular traditional benefits transfer, which is the first methods here, we call it traditional because it's what's often done. We found out of 31 studies that gave some values that were verified and scientific. 9 of them seemed applicable to rangeland trust easements. And I've seen many talks on many ecosystem valuations, and this is very typical. And putting all those together, using the GIS database about vegetation types and acreages and everything else, we came up with this average value of 0.018 cents per household per acre. And per household is important to remember because it affects the ultimate outcome. Why do we say per household? Because in traditional valuation methods, since ecosystem services are the value to people, you value them partly on how many people actually experience them. So for us, that was people living within 50 miles of each easement. We figure they had a pretty good shot of experiencing benefits from that easement, depending on what they were. Like I drove through American Canyon and the foothills every day when I was working in Sacramento, and I got some benefits. So that's this first method. It's related to how many people actually see it. When you're talking about the Hearst Ranch, what is it, 1 million people see it every time they go up to Hearst Castle? That's a lot of eyes and a lot of enjoyment for the people who go through that area. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. The second method is the global average method, and that came from a global database called the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity Database. And this is economists all over the world using a particular kind of methodology estimated the value of biomes or ecosystems all over the world. And rather than on a per household basis, their value is the value to all the people in the world. And we used that database. We were able to get more specific, actually, in terms of vegetation types with this method. But here, how many households are nearby don't matter. The size becomes a very important factor of different kinds of biomes and ecosystem types. So the results are a little different because of those two different emphases. We also did an ROI, a return on investment. Why do we do that? It's innovative, it's new. I haven't seen it before in this kind of ecosystem services valuation for easements, so it's new, it's very unique. Without Van and Reed working on the project, this never would have happened, so I think it's really good that we did this. It means that if you want to compare our results to every other study that's out there, they're not going to be in return on investment, and it's going to be on this first set of values. But if you're looking at return on investment, the reason why we did it is because if you monetize ecosystem services and you put a dollar value on them, then, and you're trying to make decisions, you make decisions on investments based on the prospective return from that investment. What do you get for what you've invested? So return on investment, as we did it, you could say, well, if we didn't invest in this easement, all the ecosystem values would disappear, and we would get 100%. Every dollar we spent went into just saving these ecosystem services. So you would say that you got the full return on your investment. But if you put your investment into a property that never would be developed anyway, then you're not really getting a return in terms of ecosystem services saved, which is what we looked at. And if a place would be developed to a certain density or a certain level, some of the ecosystem services will still be there and some of them will not. So you've saved many of the ecosystem services or some proportion of them, but not all. Now, how do you get at that? That's pretty challenging, and I'll explain that when we get to that part. So when we calculate return on investment, we look at investing in conservation easements, protects ecosystems and their services, of course. And ecosystem services values that we generated here are based on the biophysical characteristics of the property. That's what we had information about for all these 56 easements. Better, it would be even better if you knew that some of them had endangered species on them and that had a certain value, and that some of them provide something very special that everybody needs that adds a certain kind of value. Some of them might have historic buildings on them. Some of them may be in close proximity to a threat. All those things you would want to consider if you were going to try to look at every single easement in depth. But for us, we've used the GIS and the vegetation database, and so that's what our ecosystem services are based on, the things that we could tell for all the easements within the conservation, Rangeland Conservation Trust portfolio. So, as I've already mentioned, I've got a little ahead of myself. If a property would never be developed, then there was probably no need for an easement, right? If you believe that it never would be developed, for just the conservation of the raw land, there's probably no need for an easement. You could say, though, that by doing a conservation easement through the California Rangeland Trust, you're going to maintain rancher management, ranch production, fire hazard reduction, a lot of benefits that come from the act of managing it as a ranch itself. You have protected, but we didn't measure that because we couldn't. And overall, your maximum return on investment is going to come from properties where there's a high threat that they're going to be lost. And that makes sense. You want to put your investment into properties that if you don't put that investment in, there's a very high chance that they'll be lost. And of course, we all want to make investments the lowest cost for the best returns, right? So the same is true of an easement. So let's look at what we found using these methods. The total, now this is the value coming from the easements every year. Every year, it's a flow of value because these ecosystem services are produced every year and we consume them every year. So this is the annual value of ecosystem services coming from the Rangeland Trust easements every year. So if you will look at the method, the first method I mentioned, the traditional benefits transfer method, you would find a value of, for just looking at the easements that were purchased, and as I mentioned, economists are more comfortable with that because they have a divisor, you get $1.17 billion per year from the easements, just from the flow of ecosystem services. And if you include the donated easements, as you can imagine, donated easements are quite a good investment, you get 1.44 billion per year. So that's a lot. That's a lot per year for these easements that the California Rangeland Trust holds, and they're providing quite a benefit to the people of the state. And again, this is based on the people who might actually experience those easements. If you go to the global average method, where you're looking at the value to everybody on the globe, and I think there is value there for everybody on the globe myself, but if you took that as your measure, then you have $679 million every year coming off the purchased easements and $900 million per year coming from the purchased and donated easements. So what you have here is a range of answers to the question that give you an idea of the amount of variation, but it's a spectacular value by any of these four measures that are coming from these easements every year in ecosystem services, just the sheer value of what's coming off of them. That's what you've got. It's tremendous monetary value. And that's something that needs to be pointed out. And this is a conservative value based only on rigorous published information. We didn't guess. And we didn't hope. We just used what we could get. So you could see this as a minimum value. So we employed 3 development scenarios to measure the return on investment. Now, if you want to compare our study to other studies up there, you don't need to go any further. The other studies that are out there would give you these numbers, $900 million to $1.17 billion per year for these easements, and that would be the typical study. There's some studies out of Colorado and other places, and this is the kind of thing that they did. But we took it a step further, using 3 different development scenarios. And as usual, we can't just make these things up. We need to use the information that's out there that has some credibility, or at least some known foundation. Even if you disagree with it, you know where it came from, and you can then take that and show how it could be done better. That's what science is. But we used what we could have access to, and that was basically the appraisals that were done when the easements were purchased or donated, and that were part of that process. And that's for most of the easements, not all of them, so we couldn't do all of them. But then the other one is the general plans that the land in the easement is part of. Okay, so we look at these, and we developed 3 different scenarios: short term, medium term, and long term. Now the long term scenario, I'll start there because that's the same as the information above. It just means that if we didn't put this easement on it, the land would be completely developed and all the ecosystem services would be lost. So our investment saved all the ecosystem value on this property. So, and by that, long term is 1.17 billion per year, or 1.44 billion per year, or 900 million per year. It's just a whale of a lot of money per year that we've saved by making this investment. And that assumes that the investment saved all the ecosystem services that would have been lost. Short term, well, the appraiser gives what he thinks is the highest and best use for each property. And this is what he thinks is likely to happen and should, under normal circumstances, happen to the property, as I understand it. That's the short term. So if we look at that highest and best use, and let's say it's dividing into 60-acre parcels for ranchettes or 20-acre parcels for ranchettes, and we estimate how many of the ecosystem services would be lost under that scenario, and we did that based on development footprint of those properties. That would be how much we returned, because by putting this easement on, we stopped it from being divided into 20-acre ranchettes, and we prevented the loss of the ecosystem services that would have been lost with the additional houses and roads and other things that go with that. So some things, of course, well, anyway, that's what we did. So that's one value we got for your investment. Your investment prevented that from happening. And the second is the medium-term prospects. What would that property be like if it was developed out to the maximum extent allowed by zoning? This is the one we like. It's pretty conservative, again, because we don't know that that's going to happen. But it's a pretty good estimate, I think, of what could be lost without an easement. So by putting the easement on, we prevented this maximal extent of development allowed by zoning and saved the ecosystem services that would have been lost by that. So that's why we made the investment. Our return is ecosystem services that were saved by not having it developed to its maximum zoning extent. And we did that similarly to the highest and best use calculations by looking at the footprint of development, the roads, the acreages that would be lost, and connecting that to ecosystem services that would be lost under this maximal development. Okay, so here's the full results, and I mentioned there's a lot of them because we use 2 different methods and 3 different ways. And let's look at full development. Well, here's the total ecosystem service value produced each year. Can you guys see my cursor? No, right? No, you can't see my little arrow. So let's just go row by row from the left. The first, or column by column, starting with the left-hand column, we can see all purchased easements and all purchased and donated easements. And I've mentioned that those will be part of this analysis throughout. Then we move 1 column over and we look at the traditional benefits transfer method versus the global average method. So we have 2 different results. As you can see, we have a lot of results. Which is good, I think. Anyway, we have the total benefits transfer method and the global average method for each of those 2 numbers of easements. And if you look at the total ecosystem service value produced each year, that's where you get this range from 1.44 billion to 679 million. And with all purchased easements, you can see that under the traditional benefits transfer method, you have a value of 1.17 billion per year, and so on down that column. Hopefully that's clear, right? So that's the flow each year. What about our return on investment? So let's use the first one, current highest and best use as defined by an appraisal. Well, that return is not so great. For most of them, you get less than $1 back for each dollar invested. And I think I can explain that. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I think that can be explained by the fact that some appraisals say this land can never be developed. There's no water, there's no this, there's no that, or there's something else going on that indicates to us that I think the highest and best use is to remain as a ranch. And therefore we haven't really, under that scenario, saved anything, so we don't have a return. So that's what causes that. Even so, under at least one of the scenarios, we do get a positive return of $1.08 per every dollar invested. So that scenario is one that we used. We have to think about what that means. Times change in terms of what's developable or not. The types of threats change. A lot's going on in the world, so this is based on a particular point of view and one person's view of the future of the property. Now, if we look at where this property is in the general plan, and we move over to the maximum development under current zoning column, and we look at what the general plan allows, which is the one that we favor, it's the least subjective, and we look at the return on investment, we start to see some nice positive numbers. I mean, I would like to get $3 back for every dollar I put into something. That would be great. So this is pretty good returns here if we look at the maximum development under current zoning. And with this ranges from what, $2.85 per dollar we've invested to $3.47 for every dollar that we've invested. I'd accept the $2.85 return too. And then we get to the column full development, which, as I said, is comparable to most studies out there and assumes that all the ecosystems services would be lost if we didn't put the easement on it. And that's going to be our highest value that we're going to find in any case. And the dollars returned per dollar investment get quite high, all the way up to $167.76 for every dollar we put in. I'd like to find that investment too. But these are what they are. Now, there isn't a right answer here. There's not a right answer here because all the values have to be estimates, and all the scenarios are what we think might happen. But we know how we got these values, and we get a good range of them, so we know the ballpark of what we're talking based on current information. And I think it's very strong and valuable information. Okay, so we can use that. As I mentioned, one of the reasons why we value ecosystem services is to help us make decisions. So how does this help us make decisions? Well, one could build some pretty complicated models, but here we have a fairly simple set of criteria that we recommend based on these results. You can use return on investment on both current and future investments. So you could calculate the return on investment of different prospective easements and use that as part of your decision process. And I want to emphasize the part because there's so many other factors that go into those decisions, like the relationship, the special things that might be on the easement, endangered species, view shed. There's a lot of other things that go into it that we couldn't necessarily take into account, and special kinds of threats too. So this provides part of the information that could be used to make a decision. To maximize return on investment in general, being close to population definitely raises the number of ecosystem services, or the value of ecosystem services that are consumed by people. obviously. So you could be producing ecosystem services somewhere, but if nobody ever benefits from them, and believe me, and few people ever benefits from them. Nobody, it's not a nobody thing, but few people benefit from them. That's probably less value for some kinds of investment. So close to population, doesn't have to be right next to it, but that would be something to consider. How many people are likely to see this thing? Is it at risk of development? Because when you look at those scenarios, being at higher risk of more intense development raises the return on investment considerably. That's what those scenarios tell us. And then finally, of course, we want the lowest possible cost per acre. So somehow the trust has to balance these considerations and the other ones that might be out there. I wish that we had been able to value the value of grazing itself. That's clearly something that needs to be done in this state. For fire hazard control, for habitat management, there are so many values to the process of grazing and some costs. It would be really, really interesting to look at that, but this is just purely on the biophysical aspects of the easement. And we have a high degree of uncertainty because of our limited ability to predict future development and future costs and benefits. We have to speculate based on the information that we have. There's many other criteria that the trust uses, of course. And it's pretty apparent that even with minimal, even if you assume any minimal conversion in the absence of an easement, you get a positive return for your investment. So key findings, the value is really high of the ecosystem services that come from Conservation Rangeland Trust lands, really high easements, depending on the different estimation methods you use and whether you count donated easements, etc. Rangelands return, and this is with our conservative scenario based on the general plan, which I think is a pretty good one, return $3.43 to $3.47 for every dollar you invest. And when assuming that all ecosystem services would be lost without a conservation easement in place, values rise a lot to $104.21 to $167.76 per dollar invested. So we think that conserving California's private rangelands is a good investment. I can tell that just by looking at them, but this gives us some monetary values which are of great use for making decisions and for telling people it's a good message. And they're vital to protecting ecosystems and all the benefits that they provide to society. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Huntsinger. As you can see, the results of this investment, our investment into these easements, return a tremendous amount of services and dollars and values to folks in California. So how can you help? We have both a mix of public and private fund sources that allow us to do this work and protect these ranches in perpetuity. Most of these are public funds. They come from myriad sources, both state and federal. You have a list here. A lot of these are funded through either the state's general fund or through bond measures that have been passed by the voters in the past. We have bond measures that are constantly before the legislature, being considered by the legislature. And these, as of late, have not really had the dollars in there that are necessary for protection of working lands. So as you listen to Dr. Huntsinger's report today, and you see the value here, advocating with our policymakers about how important it is to do this work, that's where you really could help. It's a mixture of public and private funds. So if you are so inclined to assist us on the private side, you can share this report with policymakers. Check out our website, and there you can find ways of supporting us through contributions so we can continue to do this work. With that, we'd like to open up to questions and answers. I know we've got several that are in the queue. So, Alyssa.
Yeah, we have some great questions here. Michael, we'll start with you. We have a question that is, can you elaborate a little bit more on what conservation easements are, the different types, and what they protect?
Sure. So as I said at the beginning of the webinar, we were started by the California Cattlemen's Association on the thought that there might be a few ranchers out there that were interested in doing a conservation easement, but no organization that was in existence that understood the business. Well, that few that we thought were out there has really exploded and turned into over 73 easements, I believe we have right now, closed easements across the state, giving us a portfolio of 342,000 acres. Done that because the trust we developed with the ranching community. So a conservation easement is a perpetual contract that it's recorded, it runs with the land, and the landowner voluntarily comes to us and expresses an interest in doing an easement. We don't go to them. We don't have a map on the wall with circles and say, this is what we want, land we want to protect. That is up to the landowner. The landowner approaches us, we start that work, and we look for the funding sources if it's a purchased easement, or if they're looking to donate that easement and they do so for the tax benefits or just for the reason that they want to know that that land's going to be protected permanently once they're gone. We look for those funding, we make this project happen when we identify that funding, and then the development rights are what we're securing, those either being purchased from the landowner or donated by the landowner. We hold those development rights in perpetuity, and in essence, they're extinguished. So that land's going to remain as it is today once that easement is completed. Again, it's a voluntary action. The land remains in the landowner's ownership. Landowner continues to ranch it, farm it, live on it, enjoy it. Just can't put a Walmart on there, break it up, subdivide it, and destroy those ecosystem services that we've now shown you what that value is.
Great, thank you, Michael. It looks like we have a question here for Dr. Huntsinger. Was fire fuel reduction to reduce the impact of wildfires accounted for in this study?
Absolutely not. And that would be a wonderful thing to study. We couldn't include something that isn't out there, and it's not out there. I know there are people that are very serious about pursuing this. I, for one, think that the value of grazing in fire and fuel reduction has been poorly studied and not studied enough. Neither that nor the opportunity to really plan grazing. Right now we graze for a bunch of purposes, but that's not usually a major goal. And if we made it a major goal, what could we accomplish and how much would it be worth? I think that would be a fabulous thing to study. But again, and you'd have to think really creatively. That's one thing. Economics actually gives you some opportunities to think creatively about how you put a value on things. Where do you get those values where they have credibility? Anyway, it's a wonderful study. It hasn't been done, and so we were not able to consider it. But it would only add to the value if you ask me.
So on that note, Dr. Huntsinger, we have another question here that says, it seems that many ecosystem services were not included as part of the study. Considering this, are the values presented potentially underestimations?
I think they're absolutely underestimates. I do, and I think that is the case with every study that's out there, and anybody that does them will tell you that, because for one thing, we'll never put a value on some things. Some people have a lot of spiritual relationship with the land. Valuing that would be pretty hard. There's ways, for example, how often do you go there and what do you spend to go there? But that's a challenge, and many of the studies simply haven't been done. So I'm going to say that these are underestimates, absolutely.
Great. Michael, it looks like we have a question here that you can take the lead on, which is, do you have other ranches that are still awaiting conservation? because of the need for funding in your portfolio?
Oh boy, do we. As I said, we've been able to build a trust with the ranching community. And with that comes a large interest in what we're doing and landowners who are willing to permanently protect their working lands. Right now, our active list exceeds 200,000 acres. We've conserved 340,000, and we have another 200,000 on our active list. If we were to look at what it would take to clear that off, and I get that question actually quite a bit from folks, particularly policymakers, what would it take to close all those projects? Our estimate, based on some recent values per acre for easements, it would take about $150 million to actually close all those projects. That's a lot of money, but when we look at the dollars that are going into these bond measures, that really isn't that much. And it's enough to take advantage of the opportunity that these landowners are willing to permanently protect these lands. That number, that 200,000, actually has been higher. We were close to 400,000 acres at one point, but things changed. Ownership changes. Landowners are unable to continue to wait for the process. It could take a few years to get an easement closed. So having an ample funding available to close them while we can is really important. But yes, we've got quite a few that are looking for this to happen.
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Huntsinger, we have another question for you. And it is, are there any alternatives to the per household basis that could be applied to the traditional benefits transfer methodology, such as per capita of county or state, and how would that impact the value?
Okay, well, that's complicated. Of course, that could be done. You could also do the value for everybody in the state. That is what we did with the global average value. So we leapt right to the globe and compared. They're both benefits transfer, but the global average is not on a per household basis. It's the work that ecosystem services economists around the globe did, looking at the value to everyone on the planet. Now that lowered the values a little bit, interestingly enough, but that's probably because it's even less specific than what we did. So I don't know how it would come out if you did it these other ways, but it could be done. There's no reason why not. But we thought that in the keeping with the idea that we wanted to look at using this first method, the value to people who experience the ecosystem services benefits directly, we used households within 50 miles. We could certainly do that for the whole state and see what that was. It would give us probably a value somewhere in that range that we calculated for the closer number of people. The value gets diluted as you move further and further away too, so it doesn't necessarily increase the value as I understand it. But if you want to pursue it further, we would want to talk to Van and Reed. It's a good question. Very good question.
Michael, here's another one for you. Following along the lines of the question about funding, do you think proposition/bond money is the only way to fund these projects? Or should the state make more commitments for stable, ongoing funding for the protection of these working lands?
That is a great question. And no, I don't think that the bonds are the most reliable source of funding. A stable, consistent funding source through some means would be wonderful. We've talked about doing that, but finding the political support for that has been a challenge. Our partners in Colorado, the Colorado Cattlemen's Ag Land Trust and other land trusts in Colorado, benefit from the Greater Outdoors Colorado program, or something along those lines. Messing that up, I'm sure. But it's a stable source that they derive from lottery income. So if there was a similar, consistent, stable source on which we could bank, then that would be real good for us here in California. So working towards that, that goal, but we have a long way to go.
Thank you. Dr. Huntsinger, this one's for you. Can you briefly speak to the valuations used for the individual ecosystem services such as water, food, climate regulation, etc.?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Nick. I know the questioner. And we didn't do that for return on investment specifically, because what we did is take the value that we calculated for each easement, and we summarized, the value that incorporated some of all those things, whatever we could get values for, that generated the value for each easement. And we used that value to calculate return on investment. We could break it down by these different I don't know what to say, sources. We could break that down, and that would be interesting. The data is, as I mentioned, pretty general, so it could be a little bit hard to really nail that down, but it's possible, and I think it's a good question. I think what she's asking is, what's the return on investments for water? What's the return on investment in terms of recreation value, and so on? Because those values tend to be lumped in some of the sources that we used, it would be a challenge.
Thank you. Michael, I'm going to throw this one back to you. Do you have a sense of the ratio of bond dollars raised for conservation of watersheds versus those raised for the conservation of working lands?
Great question. I do not have that answer. I'm curious though. I'd like to find out. So I will do some poking around, but that's a great question.
Okay, we will try and get back to that. Dr. Huntsinger, can you explain what the return on investment figures are based on? It says the $3.43 to $3.47 figures. Are those based on invested capital or per acre?
They're based on present net value of invested capital, as I understand it. The ultimate values, the values originally were on a per acre basis, but they're summed and then used in the return on investment calculations. And it's a present net value return.
Great. Okay, Dr. Huntsinger, another question for you. Do you have any idea on how one could put a value on endangered species?
Oh, yes, they're asking about a Texas study. Maybe they valued endangered species in that study. I think there are ways, and this is another one of those opportunities for economists to be creative. In our study, there were two basic ways people got information. One is by doing a survey and say, how much would you pay to save X? And then another way is to see how much do people spend to see X. So in other words, how much gas do they spend to recreate, or how much gas do they expend to go see a view, and those kind of things. Those are two ways that economists use to put values on things. Endangered species, it would be a challenge, but I think it would be possible. And I don't know how it would be possible because they're so defined and precise, and their locations and all that. I think you could do it, and obviously the implication is that they did that in Texas. We would have had to have information about every endangered species on every easement, and this study, that was out of scope for our study.
Okay, another one for you, Dr. Huntsinger. It looks like there might be a little bit of confusion between the difference of highest and best use and the approach used for that, and then the maximum development allowed by zoning. Can you explain the difference on that a little bit?
Sure, I'll make an attempt. Okay, so as I understand it, highest and best use is done when the property, and Michael may actually know better than I, when the property is put into an easement, the appraiser has to estimate the value for I suppose, tax purposes. And the appraiser goes out there and he uses his subjective judgment as to the likely fate of the property. So it's more subjective. It's more a judgment based on the knowledge of the appraiser, as all appraisals are. I'm not questioning it. But that's a different basis from the general plan, which is a planning process where lines are drawn around areas, and there's an urban limit line. We're not going to allow any development beyond that. Here is a place where we're going to allow 2 houses per acre. Here's 1 house per 20 acres. They're not, they're, it's a known thing. It's in the planning office. Anybody can access it. And they can often be different from the appraiser's judgment. Although the appraiser would take that into consideration, they would also be very specific about topography and water supply and so on, and current conditions. So they're very much a function of the moment in time. And as we know, technologies, threats of development, all those things change over time. So the appraisal is also very much a point in time judgment, whereas the general plan is supposed to be a long-term outlook for the property or for the land. And I hope that's enough. It's about the extent of my knowledge.
Looks like we have time for just a couple more questions. Dr. Huntsinger, did you say the ROI is an annual calculation or a net calculation?
No, it's a present net value.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Huntsinger, was carbon sequestration factored into the study?
We just don't have the information for every easement in California. Like to know that, but we don't have it. So we couldn't do it.
Okay. And
I think there may be some of the estimates for the biomes may have included nutrient cycling, and that may have included carbon cycling, but as a direct component, we did not do that.
Thank you. Okay, and final question, Michael, we'll throw this one at you. Will you be sending the presentation out following the webinar?
Yes, we will. We will send a link out to all those who registered. We had well over 120 registered for today. And I saw we had quite a few, almost touching 100 that were actually live today. So thank you all for being a part of that. When we set out and asked the question at the beginning of whether or not to do the study, you know, like I said, we intuitively knew that this was going to be a lot of value, but we had no expectation that the mind-blowing numbers were going to come back that we see in the study. And as you just heard Lynn say, we can't value everything. They couldn't value all those services because that data just doesn't exist. So by any means, what you see here is an underestimate of the ecosystem service values of our conserved lands. Just another note that was 305 or 306,000 acres that UC Berkeley studied. Our portfolio today is 342,000. So any way you look at it, that 1.44 billion in annual services, the value of annual services is an underestimate. So that's just incredible. But thank you all for being a part of this today. And I want to thank Dr. Huntsinger and her team for this incredible work. It was a lot of work, and they really just did a wonderful job of analyzing all this data and coming up with this result. Thank you to the CRT staff, particularly Alyssa, for all the hard work that they put into putting the study together, and all of your interest and time for watching this today. And if you want to share the study, the link is there that we have provided. The link is also on our website. So please get the study out there. I know that was one of the questions of what we can do to share this information. We are embarked upon a pretty extensive rollout process right now. So please help us with that. Share the link, share the study. There's an executive summary as well that can be shared. And again, thank you for taking the time today. Get a link for the recording. Feel free to share that as well. And we really appreciate everything.
Thank you, guys.